Hello and welcome to today's presentation of our Tackling Toileting webinar series. Today is the first webinar in our series and looks at things to consider both before and during your toileting journey. My name is Bethany Bruin and I am an occupational therapist and part of our subject matter expert team here at Autism Ontario. And today I'm joined by my colleague, Kristen Gunby, who is a behavior analyst and also part of our team. This presentation is pre-recorded. So after the recording plays, we will be here live to answer your questions. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box below, and we will do our best to answer as many questions as we can. Before we get started, we have a quick video to show with some information on the use of language throughout this presentation.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our Autism Ontario presentation. Before we get started, we have some housekeeping items we need to cover. At Autism Ontario, we recognize that language is powerful, and the use of referential language as it relates to autism is a sensitive, important, and ongoing conversation. Autism means something different to everyone. Medical professionals and researchers may talk about it one way, and self-advocates and family members may talk about it in a different way. There are two main terms or phrases we hear about used to identify the autistic population. The first is person-first language, for example, person with autism, and that reflects the belief that autism is separate from a person and does not define them. Alternately, identity-first language, for example, autistic person, reflects the belief that being autistic is an important part of a person's identity and cannot be separated. Both terms will be used in today's presentation to respect both views. However, we encourage you to ask the person you're speaking with what their preference is. For more information on the use of language here at Autism Ontario, I encourage you to look at the language statement released in 2022. Opinions reflected in this presentation are those of the presenters and do not necessarily reflect Autism Ontario's views. Autism Ontario does not endorse any specific therapy, product, opinion, service, or individual. We do, however, endorse your right for information. Autism Ontario strongly believes that it's important to do your own research and make your own informed decisions. A reminder that during this presentation, we aim to answer all your questions. However, we are unable to answer specific questions about your individual child. It's always a good idea to check with your doctor or pediatrician as a first step before putting any strategy or intervention into place. This is just to rule out any health or medical factors that might be playing a role. We hope you enjoyed today's presentation, and thank you again for joining us. Let's get started.
So today is part one of our mini-series, and we will first be discussing why toileting skills are important. Next, we will be sharing information about communication, social, and environmental considerations that you may want to think about both before and during your toileting journey. In our part two presentation, we will be discussing toileting schedules and self-care routines. Part three will review strategies for daytime toilet training for urine or pee, and daytime toilet training for bowel movements or poop. And finally, in part four, we will go through bedwetting and upset or challenging behavior. Throughout this mini-series, we encourage you to think about and consider your child's unique needs and values, as well as your family values and your culture. There may be considerations that you might want to bring forward to the healthcare professionals working with you or your child. And while this mini-series will aim to summarize what is current in research and clinical practice, there's always room and space for what is important to you and your family.
Learning to use the toilet and other associated skills can be a really big milestone for an individual and their family. Being able to use the toilet independently can have a lot of benefits, including increased independence, providing more opportunities to try new things like using a urinal for the first time or going for a sleepover, decreased associated financial costs. So as you learn new toileting skills, you may no longer have to pay for diapers, for example, and mitigating risk of harm by not having your child be reliant on others to help with toileting activities like dressing, undressing, and wiping. We want to acknowledge that toileting is not a simple or straightforward process, and that for many children with autism, it can take some time to learn how to use the toilet independently. Toileting can encompass a number of different skills. Deciding on which toileting goals to focus on first and which are best left for later can help the learning process go smoother and be less overwhelming for you and your child. So we've created a fairly comprehensive toileting guide to go along with this mini-series. The toileting guide can be found in our resource window directly under the slides, and it's listed under presentation slides and resources. This resource is intended to support parents and caregivers of autistic individuals who are interested in learning more about toileting and the various skills that it entails, when it might be time to focus on a particular skill, which professionals can help, and common strategies that are used to support each toileting skill area. This mini-series reviews the content of this toileting guide in sections, but you can also feel free to take a peek at it now. You can read this resource in its entirety or just skip to the sections that you feel speak more to your current interests. So moving on, let's get started and we'll talk about what to consider before and during your toileting journey. Our first consideration we want you to think about is communication. We want to empower autistic individuals to feel they have a way to tell someone when they need to use the washroom, ask where a washroom is, and communicate if anything is wrong or uncomfortable. Some children may use vocal communication and others may not. If your child doesn't yet have a way to communicate their toileting needs, you may want to work with a professional and explore the use of an augmentative and alternative communication system. Some examples of AAC systems include a sign for toilet, a picture-based system where your child can show you the picture of the washroom, or a speech-generating device such as a tablet with a communication app. There are a lot of different ways to support an individual in learning to communicate, but it's helpful to start having discussions around the most appropriate method of communication before you start toilet training. When looking for support with communication, you can request the help of a speech-language pathologist or a board-certified behavior analyst, and they can help you identify an appropriate communication system and support with the various skills involved in learning how to communicate with others. If you're looking for more information on AAC, Tracy Lindblad, our colleague, has a mini-series on that very topic, and that can be found in the resource section as well. Now we're going to move on to our next consideration, social considerations. So here you can see an example of some unspoken expectations. The toilet paper is not refilled, the toilet seat is up, and there's pants and underwear on the floor. If we don't explicitly draw attention to these expectations, autistic individuals may not know that they are, in fact, our expectations. So we may need to look at the social expectations also in different environments and in different cultures. A lot of these rules are unspoken and they're unwritten, and autistic individuals sometimes have difficulty understanding these expectations if they're not pointed out or taught to them. So here are some more examples of social expectations that may need to be taught. Sometimes the expectation can also differ from one environment to another. For example, in some cultures, you may use a washcloth at home, but maybe there's no access to a washcloth in a public washroom. So we might need to support an individual in understanding the difference between the two settings. We suggest that you reflect on some of the unspoken social expectations that your child may need help with. Some of these might not come to you until after your child begins toilet training, and that's okay. As you identify these, you can better support your child by bringing them up to the professionals supporting with toileting. A speech-language pathologist and a board-certified behavior analyst can help you teach your child these social expectations. And now I'll turn it over to Bethany to talk about environmental considerations.
Thanks, Kristen. So the bathroom environment can include various noises, smells, and other sensations that may be uncomfortable or overwhelming for your child. Before you start on your toileting journey, you may wish to consider how you can set up your bathroom environment or practice bathroom activities that can support your child in feeling better about that space. This can help set up your child for success by having an environment that they feel comfortable in before you start working on these skills. So here are some examples. If your child is interested, you can show them how the toilet works and offer an opportunity to flush. You can make sure that your child can sit comfortably on the toilet and has somewhere to rest their feet. Proper positioning, including foot support, is also important during bowel movements. In other words, having a way for your child to brace their feet so they can engage their tummy muscles when they're pushing out their poop. You may want to consider using a potty chair or adding a stool. Sometimes seats can be added to your toilet, which may be called a reducer ring, a potty ring, or a seat cover to help your child feel more secure when sitting on the toilet. So we have an example pictured here on this slide, and this example offers handles for climbing up or for holding onto or bracing while sitting. There's a smaller seat for comfort and a step for climbing up on and for supporting the feet while seated. An analogy I like to use is thinking about the difference that you might feel as an adult if you're seated in a chair with your feet well supported on the floor versus if you're sitting on a bar stool type of chair where your feet are dangling. So you can think about the difference where you might feel much more secure and comfortable and can sit for a longer period of time when your feet are supported. For older children, youth, and adults, we also want to consider the right size or height of the toilet, as well as any motor or movement challenges that may affect toileting. Next, we want to think about placing items within easy reach. So for example, toilet paper, wipes, or water for cleaning. And we want to be mindful of sensory needs as well. So we want to aim to reduce sensory overload by offering maybe noise-canceling headphones or earplugs to reduce echoes and address fears of sounds. So that automatic flushing sound that can be distressing for some folks. And one easy strategy you can also try is just opening the windows if possible to reduce smells. Opening the window is often more easily tolerated than a noisy fan, and it allows for fresh air to circulate. We might for younger children who are just getting used to spending time on the toilet, you might also want to make bathroom visits a positive experience by offering a special book to look at or a song to listen to while sitting on the toilet. You'll want to make a plan for using bathrooms outside of the home as well, as they may offer or include different noises, smells, or other sensations that your child may or may not be comfortable with. You'll want to plan for things like unpredictable flushing, hand dryers, and lineups at public washrooms. So your plan may include things like using sticky notes to block sensors that set things off automatically, looking at a social story together before visiting a public washroom, bringing sensory headphones, or looking for alternate family washrooms. Keeping in mind some of these things you can control and some of the things you can't. So some of these adjustments you can make yourself, and others you may require more support with. When looking for support with environmental modifications, you may request the help of an occupational therapist or an OT. So to summarize today's introduction to toileting, here are some main takeaways. Toileting is an important skill to teach that has many benefits. Prior to starting toileting, individuals and their families should think about and plan for communication systems, social expectations, and environmental expectations. And now we'll have an opportunity to answer some of your questions. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you so much for submitting your questions. We've already had a few in the question and answer here so far. And we just wanted to remind you that this is a 4-part series. So if you were able to register for all 4 of the sessions, we will be answering some of the questions as we go through. And we also mentioned there's a toileting guide that goes along with this. So if you wanted to take a look at that online or download a copy, you can always skip ahead to the section that may answer your question best. And if you're not able to attend all of the sessions, they will be recorded. So you can always check back at a later date if you'd like to take a look at them then. So now we'll get to some of those questions. We had a question about overcoming the fear. So how do we overcome the fear of the bathroom for kiddos? And I think that really ties into that section where we were talking about the environment and just being mindful of what's going on in your child's environment in the bathroom. So that might be visiting different washrooms in the community to see what they look like, what type of sensory input you might be experiencing in those washrooms before you're even expecting to be using those for toileting or toilet training. And again, keeping in mind your environment at home. So if you have multiple washrooms in your home and you wanted to try out different types of flushing or different sounds or smells that might be experienced in those washrooms, it's a great way to take a look from that sort of environmental perspective. We also had a similar question around what should be done in school life and public toilets while preparing for toilet training at home. So that really ties in closely, where the first thing we're going to want to do if we're talking about school is check in with our school team to see what their plan is and what they're sort of on board and prepared to follow up with at school. So we're keeping consistent at home and at school. But again, checking out the washroom in your school environment, checking out the washroom in your community, maybe places that you frequently visit or other homes that you visit, family members. It's a great idea to kind of check that out with your child and do some experimenting, playing around before you're focusing in on that toileting piece. I don't know, Kristen, did you have anything you wanted to add to either of those questions?
I think we'll talk a little bit more about some of the fear and reasons for maybe some fear in part 4, understanding upset and challenging behaviors, because sometimes if we have a painful bowel movement, then it might mean that the next time we go to the bathroom, we're less willing or open to go because of what happened before. So really looking at that investigation into why the individual is maybe feeling fearful or afraid of the toilet as well.
Thanks, Kristen. So we're getting lots of great questions in here. We'll just take a few moments as we look through them. And again, some of these questions may be better answered in other sections or other parts of our series. So I know everyone has specific questions about your family or your kiddo, and we'll try to get to them as best we can. I just see a question about thoughts on using a potty versus using a toilet ring on a regular toilet. So that toilet ring is kind of what we saw pictured on that slide, a reducer ring, where rather than having a larger size toilet seat that would be more appropriate for an adult, there's sort of a smaller sized toilet ring that you can put right on your own toilet. And I think you're asking about the difference between that versus using maybe a smaller child-sized potty. Of course, my answer is going to be, it really depends. It's going to be an individual decision, but keeping in mind certain things. So one of the benefits of having a smaller potty is what we talked around with that foot support piece. So if they're nice and close to the floor, where they can have their feet touching the floor already and brace easier. If your child has any mobility issues or mobility challenges with climbing up and down on the toilet, then sometimes that smaller potty is helpful. And a smaller potty is also sometimes helpful for using in different parts of the house. So if that's something you wanted to try, maybe if you only have access to one washroom and sometimes that's not available, it's nice to have a potty that you can use in different parts of the house. But again, it's going to be that individual choice and what works best for your family, keeping in mind that we have that proper foot support and that your child is feeling well supported while they're sitting, regardless of which option you're choosing. Kristen, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say potties can also be helpful if your child's having motivational challenges. So if it's hard to leave whatever they're playing or engaging with to go to the bathroom, you can always start with a potty because it's more portable where they are to make that effort a little bit easier, and then slowly fade the potty as your child becomes more independent, closer to the bathroom environment, just to help with that motivation of leaving whatever it is that they're doing. If they're enjoying it, sometimes it's hard to think, I want to get up and go all the way to that bathroom, whereas if the potty is nearby, it might be a little bit easier.
Thanks, Kristen. There's a question I'm seeing around the expectation for the child to be able to communicate to us his washroom needs before we start training. So sort of if that's a prerequisite. And there were a few other questions around readiness, which is something we're going to get to shortly in our next presentation. But just addressing that issue around communication, and that again might be an individual decision. It sounds like this family's working with a therapist and just using sort of a timed toileting schedule. Again, Kristen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so if you have a communication system already in place, that's the first step. So that's great. And then when we start toileting, which we'll toilet training for pee and poo during the day, which we'll talk about in part 3, you know, it's really a process. So initially, you may have your child start indicating through communication that they have to go. And that can be because maybe your child needs some help in the bathroom. Maybe they're starting to indicate that notion of feeling a full bladder or feeling they need to go, and they're letting you know that. You may be using some positive reinforcement for success in the bathroom, and so they need you. And so it's important to communicate. Later, as they become more independent with toileting and maybe don't need so much prompting and support and reinforcement, then we can teach that discrimination piece where when you're at home, you can probably just go to the bathroom. You maybe don't need to indicate to anybody that you have to go, but maybe in other environments, you might want to tell somebody that you have to go because maybe you don't know where the bathroom is in those environments. So, it really just depends on where your child is in their toileting process, but it's okay to start with communication. A lot of professionals will recommend that self-initiating with communication, and that just indicates to everybody around that there's maybe something to be done now, that the individual is starting to notice that they have to go.
Thanks, Kristen. We have a few more questions. We started around that piece around being fearful of the bathroom. So one of the questions says, how can we remove the fear? I've noticed whenever my daughter feels pee or poo coming, she stops it. How can we encourage her to let it go to make her feel better? So I think that's addressing maybe another piece around fear, because sometimes if we have medical issues or gastrointestinal issues, there may be a fear related to it being painful to poop or to use the potty. So that's something we definitely want to have investigated with your medical team. If you have a family doctor or a pediatrician, as we mentioned, always great to check in with them about specific questions that may be more medical related. And then there's also a question around feeling fearful at school. So saying my son is very comfortable using the washroom at home, but he's scared at school while using the washroom, how to make him comfortable. So again, this might tie into this idea that there's lots of reasons why we might be fearful or might be hesitant to use different washrooms for different reasons. So something that we want to pair with our school team to problem solve around, if you do have a therapy team that's able to sort of track and collect some data maybe on what's going on with the timing around those bathroom visits. I know, for example, my daughter, when she was young, was worried about when they started doing things like music class or physical education outside of her main classroom. She was worried that if she went to the bathroom and came back to the class, then the class would be in a different room. So that was something, it took some time for us to figure out that that was what was going on with her. So then we were able to check in with the school team to alleviate that fear. So there's going to be lots of reasons, and sometimes it takes a little bit of detective work, but it's always great to be collaborating with a team, whether that's your medical team, your therapy team, or your school team, to try and get to the bottoms of some of those issues. Kristen, did you want to add anything to that?
That's great. That's great. I see a question here. What if your child doesn't feel the sensation of needing to pee or poo? Can you teach your child to do that, or is that physically impossible to teach? So it's a good question. It is not impossible to teach. In part 2 and 3, we'll be talking about that notion of someone being schedule trained, so taken on a schedule to the bathroom, and then how to move from that schedule to that self-initiation piece by typically it has to do with increasing that time between taking the person to sit. And during that time, there's learning that happens, and you're prompting a lot of things like telling the individual to communicate their needs to you so that that you can prompt them to the bathroom, and you're rewarding them for doing that. But that schedule trained often is how we start, and then we increase those intervals of taking the individual to the bathroom. And that's when the individual is really starting to feel their body and pay attention to what's happening and rely on all the teaching from the schedule training to start feeling that need to pee or poo. And so we get into that a lot more in part 2 and 3, but not impossible to teach.
Thanks, Kristen. Someone's asking for more suggestions around using a public washroom. So we use some examples around things like sticky notes to cover sensors for those automatic hand dryers or flush, and those noise canceling headphones or earplugs, asking if we have more suggestions. And I think from my perspective, the biggest suggestion I would give would be to sort of do your homework or plan ahead. So if you know that there's places that you'll be visiting frequently, and you're just looking at starting that process of using community washrooms. So maybe if you go to the library or you go to the mall regularly, then you can either take your child with you on sort of a reconnaissance mission, like going to check it out and kind of looking around the environment before you're in that sort of state where it's an emergency, we need to go to the washroom right now, and there's a little more stress involved. So you can go and check out some of those washrooms ahead of time. Another thing to look for in those community environments is family washrooms or non-gender washrooms where it's an individual washroom. So rather than having a series of stalls where there may be other noises from other people using hand dryers and sinks, it's an individual washroom with just you and your child. So sometimes, again, that alleviates some of the stress where some of that unpredictability around noises or other people is taken away, and you can sort of be on your own schedule and your own timeline to use the washroom. Kristen, did you have anything to add to that one?
No, that's great.
Okay, I see another question around, my son is very interested in flushing. He's just started using the toilet so that he can flush, but it's not consistent. How do we continue this positive exploration? So I love that you've recognized that as being this positive experience. And we're going to get to that again in one of our later sessions in this series, but talking about that idea of positive reinforcement. So I love that you've recognized that he's excited about flushing and that this is a fun part of the bathroom experience for him. So again, we'll talk a little bit more shortly about how we can use that positive reinforcement on our toileting journey.
And I see a question here. My son can pee in the toilet, but can't poop yet. He uses a diaper and he likes to stand while he poops. So we do get into this during part 3 when we talk about daytime toilet training for pee and then for poo. So some daytime toilet training programs for urine or pee will teach an individual to both pee and poo on the toilet. But we do collect data typically while we're teaching anybody daytime toilet training for pee. And so we'd be able to see if the individual required additional toilet training just for bowel movements. And sometimes bowel movement toilet training requires more of a multidisciplinary approach. And so we'll talk about that more in part 3, but data collection and that decision-making after your child is daytime toilet trained for pee, knowing like when to move on to maybe more of an interdisciplinary approach and having other professionals other than just maybe a behavior analyst or an OT, but maybe a doctor and a dietitian to support some of that learning as well. So we'll get into that in part 3.
Thanks, Kristen. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. And as we mentioned, we'll try to get to as many as we can today. But otherwise, some of these questions we can carry over to our next session so that we can address them then. Someone's asking around having sort of different messaging from different professionals, or sometimes we even get that from friends and family members. So the 2 techniques they're talking about, they said, try potty training for a few days or a week. And if the child doesn't grasp the idea, wait a few months and try again. The second technique is sort of making it routine as soon as the child wakes up, putting on the potty and sort of continuing with that schedule. So they're kind of wondering about these being 2 conflicting pieces of advice. And I think that really ties back into what we started with in the introduction around seeing what works for you, for your child, and for your family. I think it is important to highlight, and we'll get into some of those readiness pieces. Sometimes if we're trying something and it's not working and we keep pushing and keep pushing sort of on the same agenda and we're finding it's not working, sometimes it does help to kind of back up a step and maybe start on a different path and try something new. But again, that's going to depend on what works best for your family. I know, again, in my personal experience with my daughter, we tried the first time when she was quite young. We really sort of pushed that routine piece and it wasn't working. And so we did take a bit of a break and then we started up again. And in just that little break of time meant that she had more of that readiness piece, whether it was a motivation factor, maybe just taking some of the pressure off and giving her some of the control, that really did help for her. So that's just in my personal experience, but that's again something you'll want to consider for your family. So and I think probably a minute or 2 left. Sorry, go ahead, Kristen.
I was just going to say also data collection can help, because if the professional is collecting data on how your child is doing, it can help you make an objective decision on which technique is best for your child, because everybody's different. So with that, we're almost out of time. We just wanted to thank you all for your questions and your time today. We hope we see you back on Wednesday. And please be sure to answer our feedback survey.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you